My name is Lee, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. On the last podcast, I said I was doing a two-part miniseries on the lowly screw in modern Chinese literature. Yes, that's right. You think that screws are worthless? Well, and you know I have to make this pun. Screw you. I'll be here all week, folks. I should have a comedy club-style brick wall behind me. Okay. Enough for the jokes. Last episode, we looked at the glory of the screw as embodied by Lei Feng, the man who wrote dump truck poetry. The man who said, quote, "I am willing to be a screw forever." This week, we are going to take a very different perspective on the screw. I'm going to do things a little differently this episode. I'm going to first read my translation of the poem, and then introduce the poet, then go back and reread the poem, and then we'll talk about some of the literary aspects of the poem, having a sort of literary criticism discussion, if you will. Okay, here is my translation of this poem, which is by LiZhi, and the poem is simply titled, "A Screw Falls to the Ground," which is just based off of the first line of the poem. So here's the translation. A screw falls to the ground on this night of overtime, landing vertically, making a quiet, quiet sound. It will not draw anybody's attention. Just like before, on a similar night, a person fell to the ground. Just a brief note, my translation on this poem, along with a link to the original, will be posted on the website ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. As I mentioned, this poet's name is LiZhi. He was born in 1990 to a farming family in a rural part of Guangdong. In 2011, he began working for Foxconn, the company that makes iPhones. He began working in their factory in Shenzhen in 2011. He was a normal factory worker. In 2014, his 3-year contract with Foxconn was up. He left Guangdong, he left Shenzhen, he went up to Zhejiang, which is kind of in the center of China. He was trying to find more work, and I believe he went up to try and find a better position, something other than factory work, but I haven't been able to 100% confirm that. September 26 that year, 2014, he returned to Foxconn's plant in Shenzhen and signed another 3-year contract. 4 days later, Xu climbed atop one of the buildings on Foxconn's campus and jumped to his death. On October 1st at midnight, his Weibo account released a scheduled message. It just said, "New day, 新的一天." After his death, a collection of his poetry was published as a book. New day, again, just 新的一天. This poem was amongst that collection. Okay, let's read that poem again. A screw falls to the ground on this night of overtime, landing vertically, making a quiet, quiet sound. It will not draw anybody's attention. Just like before, on a similar night, a person fell to the ground. So I would like to analyze this poem on a couple of levels. First, let's take a look at the poem as its own thing without thinking about the author. Unlike the screw and the image of the screw in Lei Feng, where the screw is this heroic, if quietly forgotten, part of the machine, the falling of the screw here in this poem is presenting as something that's entirely not heroic. It's quietly forgotten. The screw itself is inconsequential. We see the setting. People are working overtime, probably in a factory, though it's impossible to say. The screw falls to the ground. It makes a very quiet noise. The Chinese is qing qing yi xiang, hinting at the inconsequentiality of the screw itself. The screw is not something that's noticed. No one's attention is drawn when it falls down. And then we see that screw being juxtaposed next to a person who fell to the ground. So clearly, this last line is comparing the screw to a spat of suicides that occurred at Foxconn, particularly in 2010, but they occurred, I think, starting around 2007, 2008, and occurred well into 2014, obviously. Okay, so that, I think, is how I would interpret the poem, knowing nothing about the author. Now, we have to ask the question, how do we think about the author and the author's biography? we always have to ask that question whenever we're dealing with anything related to literature. This is particularly important in Chinese literature because the traditional way to interpret Chinese literature, and this is coming, from several thousand years of Chinese literary studies tradition, the traditional way to interpret any work in Chinese literature is to try and kind of match it up with the author's biography. Everything has to fit into the author's biography. So understanding the author is crucial to understanding the meaning of a work, at least in traditional Chinese literary thought. Now, in literary studies in modern times in the West, and I would say probably in China too, one of the most famous essays of literary criticism is, and I know it's not fitting or perhaps it's too fitting for this discussion, but the essay is by Roland Barthes. It's titled The Death of the Author. In the essay, Barthes argues that we should not follow traditional Western literary criticism's practice of trying to figure out what is it that the author wants us to think, what is it the author wants us to feel. Barthes says, that's not the true meaning of the text. The true meaning of the text, Barthes argues, is whatever kind of you feel. So Barthes argues that we should separate the text from the author, that we should not try and find some sort of holy grail of meaning, something that the author intended. And he argues that literature should not be a puzzle that we try and figure out the author's intent. Instead, Barthes argues that the author's intentions do not matter. Once an author writes something down, it's beyond the author's control. This is what Barthes means by the death of the author. Once the author puts something down on paper, the author is dead. We don't have to care about them. A couple of months ago, I had a great discussion with a podcast listener about whether or not we should even be talking about text having meaning. On the podcast, I said, this text means this. The listener argued, hey, Lee, you shouldn't be talking about that. He's a teacher of literature, and he argues that, there is a danger in teaching students that text have a particular meaning. I think that his position and Barthes' position are both quite similar. There is, he's right, a real danger in reducing a single meaning to a particular text. If you say, this thing can only mean this thing, I would say that that's a real problem for me. Now, my question for y'all, my listeners, is how does Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, apply here? Can we turn to LiZhi and his poem and reduce it to a suicide note? That is, can we or should we read this poem on a purely biographical level? Of course, we can go back and reread the poem in light of the poet's choice to take his own life. I think if we did, the interpretation would look something like this. This poem is a kind of suicide note. Xu is seeing himself as the screw. He is seeing himself as inconsequential. His death is as meaningless as the fall of a screw. Okay, I think that's fine as a possible interpretation. But if we think about it in light of Barthes' essay, I think we'll realize that that interpretation of this poem is a bit reductive, and maybe it makes the poem a little bit less interesting. After all, LiZhi does not know the choice he's going to make in the future when he writes this poem. Perhaps he is having suicidal ideations, but it's just as likely that he's writing about other workers who took their own lives in 2010, and he is giving voice to those fellow workers. If we only look at the poem as a biographical poem, we risk closing off the possibility for thinking of this poem in a bunch of different ways. If the poem is just a vehicle to explain about the life and death of the poet, there's just something kind of boring about that. It limits the possibilities for the poet and the poem itself. I think, especially for this poem, an open interpretation is better. Of course, we can't forget the author's biography, but I agree with Barthes here. I agree with the listener that I was having a debate with. There's no absolute meaning to this poem. Shifting gears a bit, I also wonder if this poet is responding to Lei Feng. The poet is born in 1990, so he was not force-fed Lei Feng as his grandparents would have been. But that does not mean that he does not know Lei Feng's writing. he probably has encountered Lei Feng quite a bit growing up in China. Lei Feng, even in the 1990s, was, if not ubiquitous, he was constantly popping up. For me, I wonder if it's possible for a poet who's so talented, and I think Xu is quite talented. I wonder if it's possible for a poet who's that talented to not know the works of Lei Feng, even if I hate Lei Feng, and even if Xu himself hates Lei Feng, he's canonical. So is Xu LiZhi responding to Lei Feng? Is he trying to reject Lei Feng's image of the screw? I think we have to ask ourselves that question. Is he putting himself in dialogue with Lei Feng? Is he rejecting this image of the screw as a glorious machine part? Is Xu intentionally reimagining the screw? All right, I'm going to leave this poem here. If you or someone you know is having a mental health crisis, I'll leave some resources on the webpage for this episode that I would encourage you to take a look at. Today's Chengyu is not actually a Chengyu at all, because Chengyus are not just 4-character phrases, but they're 4-character phrases that have this kind of long history and have a backstory behind them. But it is a Chengyu. Okay, it's cui zhi jiang luo. And that phrase just means vertical landing. It's a phrase that is used to discuss helicopters and planes that have vertical takeoff and landing capability. This is the phrase that Xu LiZhi uses in his poem. That's it for me. If you liked this podcast, if you hated this podcast, send me an email. I love hearing from listeners. Check me out on Patreon. At Chinese Literature Podcast is the handle, my Patreon handle. I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.